First of all, I'd like to apologize for the long delay since the last meeting. And this was due to two factors. One, that I had to go in for a hernia operation, which knocked me out for quite a while. And the second reason was because this third part of our discussion paper on China, evaluating China's international role, was not such an easy one. It took us a lot of time of research, discussion, and writing the paper. And that's why the paper is 40 pages long. I don't expect that most of the comrades will have had the chance to read it. Now, why it's so long is because we've had to deal with a very complicated and important subject with very far-reaching global consequences for the present day. In fact, we're only 2 weeks away from the annual summit of the BRICS organization, which is potentially going to have a massive impact on future international relations. And that kind of sets the scene, if you like, for the conclusion of this paper, which is that the world is currently undergoing potentially the biggest geopolitical shift, certainly in our lifetimes. And in fact, it could actually be said to be potentially the biggest geopolitical shift since the birth of the capitalist form of imperialism in 1482. Potentially, at last, the poorer developing countries are beginning to mount a serious challenge to the domination of the richer capitalist countries of the global north. And by them, I mean specifically the United States and its allies in Europe and Japan. Now, certainly the Ukraine war has acted as a catalyst and has greatly accelerated this geographical shift that's taking place. And the developing countries are starting to sense the weakening of the Western powers and to feel more confident in standing up to them. We've seen examples of that in the last 18 months. We saw it in the peace deal in the Horn of Africa that brought an end to the civil war in Ethiopia and Tigray, and through that an end to the US policy of divide and rule in that region, which has led to millions of deaths and injuries in recent decades. We also have seen this shift more recently in the Middle East, when China brokered a deal with Saudi Arabia and Iran to resume diplomatic relations and effectively bring the war in Yemen to an end. We are seeing the same process take place in West Africa right now as we speak, as Niger joins Mali, Guinea, and Burkina in standing up to French and US neo-imperialist forces. Now, our paper argues that China is at the heart of this challenge to imperialism. And without China's spectacular economic success, this fundamental shift in global power would not even be on the horizon, never mind seriously contending for supremacy. Without China's growing power and the international development and financial institutions it is helping to create, the rest of the developing world would not be standing up and expressing its increasing rejection of Western bullying as it is now doing. So our paper reveals not just about China's importance in this, but also looks in more detail at how China has been pursuing a carefully worked out strategy to build a new world order free of neo-imperialist domination. And the paper concludes that we should give critical support to this movement. Now, as with all these things, nothing comes out of the blue. Inevitably, there's a historical background to every process that's taking place. Now, in our paper, we go into this background. We trace it. We start in the Chinese Revolution in 1949. Now, today in our discussion, we don't have time, obviously, to go back as far as that. So today we'll start with the reform and opening up period that followed the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. And we'll only say a few words about that and emphasize one particular point. The reform and opening up process did not just reflect itself on domestic developments in China, but also influenced how China operated internationally. And for about 30 years after Mao's death, up until around 2009, China followed a low profile internationally. It was its foreign policy, which came from a short speech by Deng Xiaoping in the late 1980s. It became known as, the policy became known as hide and bide, China's foreign policy. The hide aspect referred to the idea that China should focus on building up its economy, and internationally should hide its ideological differences and growing strength. The bide aspect of the policy meant that China should wait, should bide its time until it was strong enough economically and internally, so that it could start challenging the neo-imperialist world order. Now, I use the term here, neo-imperialist, to just say a few words about that. We did refer to this subject in some previous sessions of this series that we've been looking at in developing changing world politics. Now, imperialism, I think everybody is well aware what imperialism means. It's where, you know, the old empires, and this goes back thousands of years, but the modern version of imperialism emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries as capitalism developed. It spread its operations around the world, and in particular in the middle 19th century onwards, established these empires: the British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire, the German Empire, later on the Japanese Empire, and to a lesser extent the American Empire. These were all created with where countries would take over another country or tract of land, region, or whatever it might be, and control it militarily, and establish their own political control, and form a colony. And the mother country would control that. And usually part of that process was that country or colony would have to buy all its products from the mother country. So it was a very important, played a very important role in the development of capitalism at that time. Now, at the end of the Second World War, America emerged as the dominant force internationally. It kind of accounted for half of the world economy, and America didn't want to start. It had some empire already, small, like in the Philippines and Hawaii and some of the Pacific Islands it had taken from the Japanese. But it didn't want to actually compete with the old empires of Europe. It decided its best economic policy was to get rid of all the empires, so that it could then open up and stop those countries being forced to buy from their mother countries in France and Britain and so on, so that the American companies, which by now were the biggest and most efficient, could go in and take up a huge share of the market. And so therefore, America, over a period of 20 years, used its power and influence to push the Western nations into giving up their colonies. On the other side of the picture, the colonies themselves were fighting for independence, and we had these massive independence struggles in Africa and in Asia, leading up to it included all kinds of struggles and wars of independence. And the two forces, the colonial struggles on the one side, and America being the dominant nation, deciding that it didn't support this form of empire and colony anymore. These two dominant forces brought an end to the empires largely. We've still got some vestiges of these empires, but overall, most of the empires and colonial system came to an end. But imperialism didn't disappear. It just took a new form. And that's what we call neo-imperialism, meaning a new version of imperialism. And this this form of imperialism was not so obvious, where you had a country which occupied another country, had its army there, its administration, and so on. It was done through slightly more subtle methods of debt slavery. It was done through bribery, of the leaders of these countries. It was done by threatening them if they got out of line, in many cases overthrowing them if they didn't do what the America in particular, or France or Britain wanted them to do. And there were a whole array of methodologies used to keep these countries in line and do the bidding of the richer countries, the more advanced countries. And these also included, if none of those things worked, assassinating leaders or whatever, then they would resort back to the old methods of invading, even if they wouldn't actually keep an occupying army there for much longer after they had moved in and removed that regime and replaced it with one that they wanted. Perhaps more in the last few decades, another method that's been introduced is economic sanctions, which is now applied by America and its allies against nearly a third of countries internationally. And through all these methods, they were able to ensure that to retain their dominance, so that you ended up with a situation today still, where in most cases the rich countries that emerged, if the first movers in the development of capitalism in the 18th and 19th century, are still the dominant rich countries in the world, and they've used their influence to keep down the poorer countries. Now, many of these poorer countries, if the development had been organic and natural, many of these poorer countries would now be rich countries and would be on a level with the richer countries of the past. The reason being is because they were often bigger countries geographically, with more minerals, with bigger populations. So in a normal sense of the word, they would have emerged as dominant. But the richer countries of the past have kept them down through all these methods of neo-imperialism. So I thought I'd say something about that, just to explain the terminology we used in the document. Now, China clearly understood the nature of the international system. But as I said earlier, they realized that they needed to focus on building up their own economic strength until the suitable time arrived, when it would become possible and necessary to challenge it. That period arrived with the Western banking crisis and the great economic recession of 2008 and 2009. And Themos, our colleague from Cyprus, has many times has described the significance of this event as being a turning point in the history of modern capitalism. I think we all agree with that. But as we looked into this and studied this subject, it also had an effect that we perhaps didn't consider, was that it was also a turning point in China's development, and how China saw capitalism and the Western world. Because there had been a period in the mid-90s and into the 2000s where a certain section, a minority, but a certain significant section of the Chinese communist regime had started to have illusions in neoliberal ideas and capitalist ideas. And this event shattered those illusions. First of all, and how did that happen? I think it's worth talking a few words about that. How this impacted the thinking of the Chinese leadership. First of all, the Chinese carefully studied what had caused this, and they were not held back by the needs that exist in the West to to tell the ruling class what they want to hear. So so all the analysis of the crisis in the West, in the media, which is trying to make propaganda to the mass of people and explain away these things, and also in the think tank movement that is now infest all the capitals of America and Europe and so on. They didn't want to go in depth to explain why this has happened, and but the Chinese were not held off by that. They came to understand, and there's a lot of internal documents the Communist Party produced inside the Communist Party hierarchy. And they recognized that this was a direct result of the failure of the modern neoliberal form of capitalism, and with its deregulation, its privatization, the financialization of the economy, the monopolization of ownership, the plutocratic, corrupt political system that was now ingrained in Western capitalism. And it is not just the crisis itself, but the failure of the system to actually take measures to overcome the crisis and learn from the crisis that had an even bigger impact on the Chinese. Even though the system, even though this crisis had come close to bringing down the whole system, still the capitalists, because of their whole political and economic system, were not willing to bring in the reforms that would have been necessary to turn the clock back and bring banking back under control and so on. And so they were not willing to even bring in serious reforms that could prevent such a crisis from repeating itself. And even worse, perhaps, was that the system had become so corrupt that no one responsible for the crisis and all the fraud that had brought it to a high level, to a peak, that none of these people were brought to account. So no bankers went to jail, etc., etc. So from this experience, the Chinese leadership understood that the international capitalist system had passed a decisive turning point and had entered a period of terminal decline. And this ushered in a long-term move to the left in the thinking of the Chinese leadership. For example, this deep crisis internationally in the capitalist world was immediately reflected in a loss of credibility for that small pro-capitalist wing that existed in the Communist Party of China and in the communist government, in the government. And remember, this wing had been urging the Chinese leadership to introduce further capitalist reforms, along with the IMF, the World Bank, and other international capitalist institutions. And they were arguing that they should bring in these reforms to make the Chinese economy more effective. But logically, the overwhelming majority of the leadership said, well, why should we abandon our public sector-led socialist economic model, which has been so dramatically successful and has avoided these disastrous boom and bust cycles? And the fact that this huge recession in the capitalist world and the inability of the Western governments to learn from it kind of settled this argument that there had been some argument in the 2000s in China. So from now on, the Chinese leadership abandoned any possible illusions in the capitalist road. Now, apart from this ideological impact of the crisis in the West, it also posed an immediate threat to the Chinese economy, with the possible loss of exports to the capitalist countries as their economies went into negative territory. So to avoid, losing their exports to the West and having, large-scale unemployment and all the rest of it, which is what would tend to happen in a capitalist economy, the Chinese leadership opted for a powerful public sector-led solution. So in November 2008, China's State Council introduced a massive $586 billion program of state spending, which at that time was a huge amount of money. This was called the Chinese Economic Stimulus Plan, and was a huge package of infrastructure investment representing 12.5% of China's GDP. Now, the stimulus program included public works on new roads, railways, bridges, ports, airports, housing, environmental engineering projects, and so on. And this represented a return in a practical way to a much more pro-public sector economic emphasis, which again tied in with this shift to the left in the Communist Party and in China as a whole. And the scale and success of the stimulus plan meant that China powered through this period without hardly a blip in its growth. I mean, I think it was, maybe it went down from 10.7% growth to 10.4% growth or something like that. And this again reinforced the socialist elements in Chinese government. And it actually it anticipated a radical shift and prepared China for big changes, not just in its domestic economic and political and ideological situation, but in its international position, which is what we're going to talk about now. Now, one of the interesting consequences of the big stimulus package on one side in China and the big fall in production in the West meant that was delivered by this economic recession was that China's economy grew by over 30% between 2008 and 2010. Now, if you compare that to its main capitalist rivals, the United States grew by less than 1% in these 3 years. Germany was a little better with an expansion of 3.5%, but it's pretty small. But Japan's economy actually contracted by over 4% in that period. So 30% in expansion in China, and the best was 3.5% in Germany. And this all had a highly significant impact on the relative standing of these four leading economies in the world. So when the statistics were recalculated by the German authorities in early 2009, it emerged that China's economy had overtaken Germany in 2008 to become the third largest economy in the world. Then in 2009, the following year, China passed Japan to become the world's second biggest economy. And in the same year, China outstripped the United States to become the world's biggest manufacturer. So all these things happened so fast, and in a way that the West had their attention was distracted by their huge economic crisis. But very quickly, the Americans started to suddenly realize, wow, China's gone from being fourth in the world. It's been our source of cheap product that we could import and helps offset to some extent the falling living standards in America. But now China's become not just the second position, but they're projecting ahead. They could see that China within 2 decades could become the number one economy of the world, with all the consequences that flow from that. Now, alarm bells began to ring out in Washington when they saw this. For the world's only superpower, this was obviously an unacceptable threat, and one that challenged its dominant position, a position it was determined to maintain at all costs. Now, to make things worse for uber capitalist America, China was not just another economic rival. Despite all their propaganda, which actually is moving more and more in a kind of ideological way in America, but at that time they tried to claim credit for China's fantastic economic miracle by saying, well, China adopted capitalism, and that's why it's become so successful. But they know internally that it's not like that, and so they understand that the Chinese mix of dominant socialist and subordinate capitalist forms, which has evolved in China, was a serious threat and a serious alternative to the neoliberal model in the West. And they recognized that China represented a very different economic and social system. Not one that was not only based on a public sector-led economic model, but was under the governance of the Communist Party that continued to espouse Marxism, Leninism as its ideology and socialism as its aim. So for the United States in particular, and for the capitalist class that rules it, this was the beginning of a nightmare. So panic started to spread in the ruling circles, and this explains why in November of 2011, the White House under Obama announced an important new policy shift, foreign policy shift, entitled the Pivot to Asia. And the year before, I should have said, the year before in 2010, they had started to use this new phrase of the rules-based international order. Hillary Clinton had put this forward, and this has become more and more used, as we know. They now talk about that everywhere. So they abandoned the United Nations rules-based order for this new rules-based order that they control. Now, the new Pivot to Asia that America launched in 2011 was a recognition that the main concerns for the United States had shifted from the Middle East and Eastern Europe, which they focused on, and was still hangover from the Cold War, that this had shifted over to the threat of a rising China. And in practical terms, the new policy meant the United States military began to relocate 60% of its forces to the China West Pacific area. Meanwhile, on the other side of the coin, from China's perspective, the new situation had profound implications for its own relationship with the West. And China, being far more farsighted than its capitalist rivals, they had long anticipated the impact of their emergence as an economic power. You remember I talked about their policy of hide and buy, because they knew that as soon as the West realized how powerful China was becoming, their attitude of cooperation with China would dramatically change into one of confrontation, and then in time into try to prevent China's rise with economic measures and even eventually military measures. And the Chinese, and you can if you look at internal speeches made by Deng Xiaoping, by Jiang Zemin followed him, and then Hu Jintao, the presidents who followed, they made speeches internally where they were understanding this. You could see they were anticipating that one day this position of relative cooperation with America and the West was only a temporary one, would come to an end. And so that this is what's happened. So this signaled the emergence of a new era for Chinese foreign policy. And it also, they realized that this would allow them, this growth in the economy would allow them to achieve many things that they had put on hold. And so their ambitions came to the fore. So funnily enough, in the late 1950s, Chairman Mao had made a famous speech about the East and the West winds. And he had prematurely declared that in the struggle between the socialist and capitalist camps, it was no longer the west wind, capitalist wind, that prevailed over the east wind, but the east wind that prevailed over the west. The problem was that the socialist forces in the east, the Soviet bloc and China, had this underlying economic weakness, the inferiority of their economic model to Western capitalism. And this obviously became apparent in the 1970s and eventually led to the implosion of the Soviet bloc at the end of the 1980s. But obviously China had found a way to overcome this economic inferiority, something we talked about in previous sessions. And so this opened up tremendous possibilities, not just for the Chinese people, but for humanity as a whole. And reflecting such possibilities, the Chinese leadership began to spread its wings internationally. I haven't got, in our document, we talk about the role of Xi Jinping and whether he really represents a new leadership or what's his significance. And we show that actually Xi Jinping is not this dramatic shift that has been portrayed in the West, that the shift started, as we said, when the great economic recession broke out in 2008, 2009. And so some of the major changes happened under the previous president, Hu Jintao. Where we could say that Xi Jinping was different was that one, he was more ideologically left-wing, as internal assessments by the CIA, who interviewed his friends and so on, when it became apparent that he was going to become the new leader. He was very uncorrupt. He had a very strong record of being, and even to the point where they sent him in to clear up corruption. And corruption had become a huge problem in China, which we talked about in the last session. So I won't go into it now. But also, I would argue probably that, you know, I don't want to be too deterministic here, but the time calls forth the person, doesn't it, to some extent? And I would argue that Xi Jinping is a more solid person and is perhaps a better kind of leader that you need in the period of confrontation and conflict, rather than the early leaders who were kind of transitional leaders in a quieter, calmer period. Now, one of the many lessons that China learned from the failure of the Soviet bloc was the need not just to create a political movement against the neo-imperialist elites, but also to build up a set of broad international economic organizations to underpin that political movement. And this is what we've seen China focus on in the last 10 years. So first of all, they launched the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with Russia, which is mainly covering Central Asia, Eurasia. This was actually started in 2001. So China was kind of doing some anticipatory moves. It never stopped slowly building up, but they were doing it in a very low-key way. And this Eurasian Economic and Security Body now has expanded to include India, Pakistan. Iran is the latest country to join it. Belarus is soon to join. And also several Middle Eastern countries are also associated with its bloc. And you'll see that China is developing a number of different organizations that overlap, and maybe they'll eventually all be dovetailed in together, but it's doing it to give itself more room for maneuver in case one organization goes more slowly than it wants. It can then put more emphasis into the other. The next organization that China helped to develop was the BRICS. It was first formed by Brazil, Russia, India, and China in 2006. And it was a kind of informal grouping of these rapidly growing developing countries. Now, I include Russia in this terminology because of the fall of the Soviet bloc, Russia became almost like a developing country, suffered a lot of the problems of the developing world. And in this debate about Ukraine, there's a lot of people who say, well, Russia's another imperialist country like America is and so on. But I think if you look at the evidence, I don't think it stands up that Russia, whatever it might in its heart of hearts want to do if it ever got to that situation in the future, in the last period, Russia has not been playing an imperialist role generally because it's been actually under the pressure of the imperialists. And so in that sense, again, it's got a lot in common with the developing countries, and that's why it joined the BRICS, and the BRICS wanted it to join. And then the aim of the BRICS was to kind of improve their economic situation internationally. And also they said specifically they wanted to reform the international financial institutions in their favor because, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, these had all been institutions that have been set up by the neo-imperialists and been set up to operate in their favor. And of course they had done. So the BRICS wanted, on behalf of the rest of the developing world, to start to change that. They became a more formalized body in 2009, and then the following year, 2010, South Africa joined it, and that's why we've got this current name, the BRICS. Now I'll return to the question of the BRICS and its future in a few minutes, because obviously we're 2 weeks away from the next BRICS summit, which a lot of people are now looking at the significance of. But before I talk about that, I need to just say a few words about the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, I don't have time to go into this in much detail, and we do in the document. We go into a lot of detail about how the thinking, how the operation of it. We answer all the Western propaganda against the BRICS with bullshit propaganda about debt trap diplomacy and imperialism and so on. And we show how there's nothing to that. But just to sum up, that the Chinese understood. There were several motivations why they set up the BRICS, not the BRICS, sorry, the Belt and Road Initiative. First of all, China understood that in this conflict that was going to develop between them and the West, that the US and its allies would try to cut off the trade routes of China through the Indian Ocean, and we go into that in quite a bit of detail in our discussion paper, which I haven't got time to go into now. So they realized that they needed to develop a whole series of alternative trade routes to avoid that situation. And one of the things you notice about the Chinese is that they really do anticipate events. They really have a long-term perspective and a patient and consistent approach. And they take measures long before we realize what they're doing. They're taking measures to anticipate these problems, which I suppose is what planning is all about, isn't it? So they realized that that they needed to have these alternative trade routes. But the other thing was that they realized that they needed to have a direct relationship with the developing world, who they saw as their power base. If they were going to build a new world order based on the developing world, to overturn the one dominated by the neo-imperialist countries, they needed to develop a program where they could work together with these countries. And of course, basically what they did was they took the model that had worked in China so well, and they basically exporting it in terms of building up infrastructure and all the rest of it to all these other countries. And of course, their model is not like the imperialist countries, where they want to go in and in a zero-sum game, just take all the resources of the poorer countries and keep them poor. They see their potential gain through building up those countries so there can be more trade between those countries. Those countries can be more, after all, if those countries are poor, they're not going to be able to buy anything from China. So they want to develop the economies of the poorer countries so that they can have a useful trading relationship, and that will benefit them, benefit China. So that's why they talk about the win-win relationships and win-win contracts and so on. Of course, it doesn't always work out like that, but that's their thinking. Now, the result of this incredible initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, is that China, and we publish an image in our paper that shows how China and the relationship with China and the US and the world trading system was that in the year 2000, if you look at a picture of the world, you'll find that most countries in the world, their main trading partner was America. 2 decades later, it was completely reversed. So now the situation is that now nearly 150 countries in the world, the main trading partner is China. That's an incredible changeover. I would probably think it must be the fastest changeover in international trade in history. And of course, this then gives a very solid basis for all the other geopolitical things that China is trying to develop. Now, I just want to quickly talk about the initiatives that are not well known yet, because they're quite recent, but they're going to have major impact in the world. First of all, China has put forward the Global Development Initiative. Now, what that is about is that the Sustainable Development Goals that are, well, in 2010, the United Nations put forward these millennial goals. I think 2000, but anyway, they put forward these millennial goals. I think there were 10 of them, and particularly because of the success of China, they made a lot of success in it. And of course, there was the world boom in that period. They had a lot of success in achieving or making progress towards these goals, lifting people out of poverty and other things like that. And then they decided to launch these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which they're supposed to be implemented by 2030. And these are even more ambitious. And China's had an input, clearly had an input, you can see from the language of the goals, in what goals they are. And they're things like, taking people out of poverty, clean water to being delivered to infrastructure, all kinds of different things, which are very good goals. But the trouble is that this set of goals have not been successful. Since they launched in 2015, if anything, things are actually going backwards in many countries because of the pandemic, which has caused 150 million people to fall back into extreme poverty. We've had the rising interest rates that are causing huge problems of indebtedness. We've had wars and so on. So China's come forward to the United Nations and said, look, we'll put forward this policy of the Global Development Initiative to actually kickstart this and actually seriously develop and implement these initiatives. And of course, part of that is the Belt and Road Initiative. But also what China's realized is that the United Nations has been hopelessly divided, and the bureaucracy of the United Nations is compromised. There's a lot of officials in the United Nations who are obviously pro-American, pro-Western. So what they've done is they created a group called, they got the United Nations to overwhelmingly approve the Global Development Initiative. And even the West couldn't oppose it openly, although they raised some propaganda against it, but they couldn't oppose it openly. And then they've developed an organization called the Friends of the Global Development Initiative, of which about 70 countries have already joined. And they've started having meetings of this group, which China chairs, and it's got all the usual suspects: Vietnam, Cuba, Venezuela, and so on the top table of this thing. And what they're basically doing is to cut through the bureaucracy and bypass the bureaucracy of the United Nations. They meet in the United Nations, but they completely bypass this, and they seriously getting down to implementing all the measures that are necessary to achieve these goals. China's and its allies are in the driving seat of this process. Now, the second initiative that China has launched about a year later is called the Global Security Initiative. And what that is about is basically saying, look, we've got an agenda for development, but unless we have peace and security, then this development doesn't work. And so they came forward with these ideas, which are basically anti-neo-imperialist, about saying that there should be no interference in countries' sovereignty by the West. That they shouldn't be doing these unilateral economic sanctions, regime change operations, never mind military attacks on countries and so on, bombing them and whatever. And now you might think that this wouldn't work, or this would be nice, but it's pie in the sky. But already the Chinese, in that Global Security Initiative, they put forward about the Horn of Africa, that strategy for, and that they've been able to implement that and bring peace to the Horn of Africa, which looks like it will hold. And they also mentioned in their security initiative this how it could apply to the Middle East. And we saw this tremendous agreement they managed to get between Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and Iran. Now, how they did that, they used all this Belt and Road Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and another one which they've recently launched called the Global Civilization Initiative, which is about respecting the culture of different countries and not trying to enforce your liberal interventionism to say that you must have these laws about sexual identity or whatever it might be, that countries have to develop that themselves organically, democratically. They can't be imposed from outside, including democracy and other things like that. So they've brought these things together in that whole deal in Saudi Arabia. So they made a deal where they made a deal with Iran, which is Iran welcomed greatly because basically it broke the sanctions regime, and they agreed to buy all a lot of oil from Iran over a long-term contract and to help with the infrastructure of Iran, building up new ports and pipelines and all sorts of things like that. And they also did the same with Saudi Arabia. And bear in mind that these countries are not stupid. They know that oil and gas has a limited shelf life in terms of the future, that solar energy, wind energy, and other forms of renewables will eventually overtake them. So they want to diversify their economies. And China's come forward with proposals of how to do that and the resources to help them do it. And part of the way to do that is that China has offered them like 20, 25-year contracts for their oil and gas, which is the kind of length of contract they never had before. And what they need that guaranteed income to be able to then put into diversifying the economy. But China then said to them, look, this is a great plan we have. And this is a way to bring prosperity to the Middle East instead of this constant problem of unemployed youth and conflict and so on that we've had for generations now. I said, but we can't achieve any of this if you keep fighting each other and if you allow the West to keep dividing you and setting you against each other. So eventually the Saudis in particular eventually said, oh, fuck this. Okay. And on top of that, America was no longer buying their oil because America is self-sufficient and China is their main customer, they said, well, okay, let's do this. And so, so they've decided, we'll have to see how this all works out in practice, of course, things can go wrong. But they have decided on a strategy to work together in the Middle East, which is to build up the economy of the Middle East and overcome these divisions. Now, of course, for Israel, this is a disaster, and for the Americans. We'll have to see how this plays out. But China is basically saying to the developing world, we've got to stop these internal fights, most of which have been exacerbated by the West who encouraged these things. The same with West Africa and so on. We've got to stop these internal fights and focus on lifting our people out of poverty. And that's obviously the appeal they have. Now, the last bit I want to talk about is just briefly on the BRICS, because in 2 weeks we have the annual summit of the BRICS in South Africa, and it looks like I think that we shouldn't expect things to happen very fast, because this is a huge development. The BRICS potentially already the BRICS is actually becoming stronger than the G7 in some respects economically. So and now there are over 40 countries lining up to join the BRICS, join the 5 current members. Now, if even, and they include important countries, powerful economic countries like Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Malaysia, Indonesia, Nigeria, and so on. So if even a fraction of these come, then the BRICS will become the biggest, most important organization internationally, both within the UN, within all sorts of forums. And potentially the BRICS could become an organization of 150 members. I mean, the overwhelming majority of mankind and the economy and so on. And it has, and perhaps one of the biggest tests is China wants the BRICS to basically develop a parallel economy to the West, so that they stop trading, they trade less and less with the West, and they trade more and more internally. And that's what's happening within the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, for example, last year, I think the Belt and Road Initiative, the trade within that group increased 20%. And already this year, it's 16%, which is like about 8 times faster than the world trade as a whole. So if that does develop, then it's going to cause a crisis for imperialism or neo-imperialism, because they're going to be cut off from their supply of cheap raw materials and cheap labor in the South, which they desperately need. And this is going to exacerbate the decline of that system. So the growth of the BRICS is very important. I suspect that out of this meeting, I don't know if they will actually agree to a few members joining. They might agree to Argentina, which they had promised already. But I think they will agree a procedure for new members to join, and that will just snowball as time goes on. And the other thing that the BRICS will be considering will be the question of the dollar and the dominance of the dollar in the economy. And there's been lots of talk about this, but already, and don't believe Janet Yellen's figures, which are false. She tries to maintain that 90% transactions are in the dollar, but she's double counting. So it's actually false. So it's actually reaching now in the early, it's like 50-something%. And it could go down into a minority level, given that so many countries now in the developing world are considering doing direct between their own currencies. And eventually this could well lead to an alternative currency emerging, like a basket of currency backed up by gold and other important raw materials. So but that will take time to develop. Certainly, they're developing an alternative. BRICS is developing an alternative to the SWIFT banking system. They're developing an alternative to the credit system, the Visa and MasterCard system, and so on. So I think that these are all serious challenges to the West, fundamental challenges they've never really had to face since the 19th century, if not before. The last bit I'd like to finish off with here, and thank comrades for bearing with me. So I've had to jump over lots of stuff because there's so many things involved. And the whole question of whether China's imperialist, I haven't been able to go into, but if the comrades want to talk about that in the discussion, ask questions about that, I'd happy to come back on it. The last point I'd like to make is that, and in our document, we talk about all kind of perspectives issues, the possibilities of war between US and China, and all sorts of other issues. But what I wanted to finish off on is just to say briefly, what should be the approach of socialists to China's international strategy and this geopolitical shift. Now, there are some people on the left who are very cynical about all this, and they think this is just, oh, China's just another empire, wants to take over from the Americans and so on. But when you study this, there's the evidence for that is it doesn't exist, and quite the opposite. China's making huge, and over a long period of 50 years, has been making anti-imperialist and anti-empire propaganda, and now in the last 10 years in particular has been coming forward with all these very carefully worked out strategies to bring down the power of the neo-imperialists and to raise up the principle of the poorer countries having their own sovereignty, so no country, that they all have to be treated equally, that no one can interfere in their internal affairs and so on. And it would be very difficult for China to suddenly shift from that. They would lose all credibility. And so I think we have to take this, what China is doing, at face value. And as we said in the previous session, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, looks like a duck, and maybe it is a duck, But having said that, so I think we have to be positive about this development, and we have to be supportive of it. Obviously, from a critical point of view, but wherever there are things we find that are wrong about it, we must criticize those. And that's the first principle I think we have to be, is that we have to be honest about these developments. We have to be honest about China. We have to be honest about what these developments are taking place, and where we see faults in them, we must openly criticize. I mean, one of the major problems with the Soviet Union was a large section of the left were not honest about the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. They didn't. They tried to cover up things. They tried to say everything was fine there. They didn't have open discussion about the flaws of the Soviet system. And as a result, when the Soviet Union came to reform after Gorbachev came to power, they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know how to reform. They didn't know, they had no strategy, and they made a complete and utter mess of things, to the point where the whole thing imploded unnecessarily. That's a whole other discussion. But so being quiet about the faults of the system or where it's going wrong does no favors to anybody, certainly not to working people who have to pick up the pieces of the system when it falls down. The second point is that when we provide critical support, we need to do it in a positive way, so that we don't just criticize things, but we actually come forward with constructive criticism and ideas for how that could be, what problems there are could be overcome, what alternative ways forward. And that's obviously a much more positive way to approach this, and I think it's very important for us to do that. Another thing is that where countries support these geopolitical developments, so for example, in Niger, for example, if they come on board with the BRICS, and other countries, Saudi Arabia, some of these countries have got very reactionary governments, as we know. So the fact that they are coming on board with a development geopolitically doesn't stop us criticizing them, and doesn't stop the class struggle inside those countries. Quite the opposite, that we have to carry on that class struggle. And yeah, of course, we welcome if the government does something good, but that's just, that's okay. But if they're doing crap things inside their countries, for example, let's say they do deals with the Belt and Road Initiative, and that helps develop their country, and then all the wealth that is being created by that then just goes to the top elite. Well, that's not actually implementing the principles of what China is fighting for. So the class struggle has to be developed. Now, the good thing is that as the West becomes weaker, the class struggle and these questions and left-wing policies and socialist ideas and programs can become much stronger. So it's a very positive development if we take advantage of it. We also we have to maintain our vigilance in this situation, because this path of this struggle between the developing world and the neo-imperialist world is full of dangers and pitfalls and struggles and confrontations. It's not going to be easy at all. And our role as socialists must be to do everything we can to support this process. And wherever there are problems or backsliding or whatever it might be, we have to criticize and be vigilant against them. I mean, after all, we don't want to be fighting against the current neo-imperialist system only to see it recreated in another form. And I'd like to quote, finish off by quoting Deng Xiaoping. He made it was a very important UN General Assembly session in 1974, where they were talking about an alternative international economic order. And he made a speech in which he said, if one day China should change her color and turn into a superpower, if she too should play the tyrant in the world and everywhere subject others to her bullying, aggression, and exploitation, the people of the world should identify her as social imperialism, expose it, oppose it, and work together with the Chinese people to overthrow it. And I think that you know, it might have been rhetoric on his part, but I think that is actually a good principle that we should be following. Okay, so thanks, comrades. All right, so I hope the comrades were able to follow what I was saying. I mean, it took me quite a while to say it, but as you know, it's a very broad and far-reaching subject. So I hope the comrades have some thoughts about this, questions or disagreements, whatever they might think. I don't suppose the comrades have had the chance to read this long document that we've put out yet. They might have had the chance to glance at it, but we'll return to this. It's going to be a long-term discussion inside the network. But do any comrades have any initial thoughts they would like to come through on? And don't forget to unmute yourself if you want to speak. Roy, I think I see your hand up. Yeah, go ahead, man.
Yeah, just a quick thing comes to mind, and it was something that Heiko mentioned in one of our previous discussions about whether or not the Chinese apparatus are actually attempting to develop and put forward propaganda in the system that socialism that they're operating with, to try and influence and gain sort of support around the rest of the world. And we don't see any signs of that, do we? It seems to be almost uncommittal. And we hear, and I think you've got it in your document as well, the way you say they're supplying weapons to hostile countries and stuff, and that's the worst example of it, I suppose. But then what are they doing? They're just going in, doing the job in the country and going out again, and that's it. It's interesting. I don't know if you've thought about that anymore, or what we can do about that even. That's all. That's just that one point really I wanted to make.
I could come back on that quickly. We don't go into it in too much detail, but China's got this idea that through this Belt and Road Initiative, its Global Development Initiative, that that its methods of development and what China's come forward with is a new socialistic version theory of modernization, how that countries can achieve modernization, unlike the capitalist modernization model of the past. And so their idea is that if countries take on board that model, there's using the public sector to build up their infrastructure, using the public sector to take the lead in innovation and investment, that slowly but surely their model will become the dominant force economically. In many ways, if China does emerge as the dominant world power economically, which I read a very interesting article the other day by John Ross, in which he's answering these points that are being made in the West about, oh, China's growth has come to an end, and you know what I mean. And he's very convincing in how he analyzes how China's achieved its growth, and that China will continue these policies in terms of investment and so on. And therefore, China it won't be as fast as the growth as it had in the past, like 10%, but it will be 5% kind of growth level, which is pretty respectable. And therefore, China will be in the 1930s the biggest economic power in the world. And that in and of itself, normally when that happens, other countries copy that model, don't they? You know, they're influenced by it. And with all these initiatives which China is proactively pushing, then they're confident that most of the countries will adopt its model. So in a very practical way, rather than the kind of like ideologically going out and pushing its ideology. But I think that will happen too. And especially if China is able to overcome the problems it's got that are being posed by modern developments in China, because there's a certain amount of discontent developing among the youth with the situation in China. There's the problems of the private sector is causing problems in China. If it can come forward with new models and new ways of doing things, which we hope will influence them in, so that they move away from using the private sector to solve their problems into having a participatory democratic public sector model in terms of the economy and everything else. Those then will become models for the rest of the world as well. We talked a bit about this in the last session. I think it was quite a good discussion. So, for example, China has copied the West on some things, like their education system is pretty capitalistic, competitive model, and some of their other things that they've been doing. And the young people are not happy with this. You know, the way they've done their housing and so on. The young people are not happy with the outcome of this. And so they're now under pressure to be more socialistic in their solutions and come forward with new models, which would be of great impact for us in the rest of the world. So it's not just the economic model, but it's all the social things that China has to overcome. And so now the other thing is that China is reaching out to all the left parties around the world and having regular summits of these parties. And so one danger of that, I flag up now, is that this could revive the Stalinists internationally, something we've got to be careful about. So, for example, there's proposals come forward for reviving the world youth movement, and the young communist movement around the world. And this, there are elements, of course, in the Chinese leadership who are very Stalinistic and who don't want to see genuine participatory democracy come and challenge their power that they have, and so we've got to be careful that and I noticed the Stalinists are starting to come out of the woodwork with this the same attitude they had to the Soviet Union, a totally uncritical attitude. they want to reproduce that, and they're now starting to see China as the kind of that they follow China like they followed Moscow before, and that would not be a good aspect. So, but that that will happen if we don't, if we on the socialist left don't do our job of providing a genuine critical support for China, not an uncritical support for China, right? And so, but I think the good thing is that China is actually open to criticism. They don't come forward. It's not as bad as it was in the old Soviet days, and there's a lot more debate because of the online media. There's a lot of travel going on. Tens of millions of Chinese are traveling abroad, and people are going to China. There's none of those restrictions that you used to have in the Soviet Union. So I think that there's a lot of scope for this, and I'm hoping that through the YouTube channel that we're going to launch in October, called Understanding China, that we'll start to reach a Chinese audience, large Chinese audience, with these ideas, But in the broader sense of the word, because we're dealing with this on different levels, aren't we? We're dealing with the broad struggle with the neo-imperialists of the West, and then we're also dealing with the struggle for what is the future of socialism. And in that sense, China can be a laboratory to how we solve these problems, So it's a bit of a complex thing that we have to navigate. I don't know if that answers your question, Roy, at all. That's not an easy one that you posed. Other comrades who'd like to come in? Anybody else like to say something? I think, Khalid, were you trying to say something there? Did I? Not always easy to. I've got some names.
Yeah. But I just a brief, thanks for this very good introduction. And I agree with the general points you made. And I think the document has a lot to read, and and it's a very good basis for us to have a more enriched discussion on this subject. The rise of China, the rise of BRICS, and the fast changing geopolitics, and especially in this whole situation, the role of China, as you mentioned, in Middle East, in Africa. So I just I was preparing to make a short contribution, but I think it's better if you can say something about the Chinese policy of peaceful coexistence and how it shapes up how it laid the basis of Chinese foreign policy and how they are still following it. And what is the difference, the major difference between Chinese policy and foreign relations when we compare it with the new imperialist policy of divide and rule and exploitation and dominance. So can you make a brief comment on that, just to explain that we know that, this peaceful coexistence policy is based on 5 principles: the mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, non-aggression, non-interference in internal affairs of the countries, equality and cooperation, and peaceful coexistence. So I would like if you can elaborate it a bit, so we can have a more discussion on that. Thanks, Pat.
Sure. Okay. Well, actually, peaceful coexistence, we used to make fun of it in the way that the Stalinists were interpreting it in the after Stalin died. They changed their orientation with peaceful coexistence, and the way and we used to make jokes about it, how they used to always have these vodka toasts to peaceful coexistence and all that, but actually the policy was developed by Lenin. People are not really aware of that, but Lenin developed this policy in towards the end of the Civil War, because after the end of the Civil War, he realized that Russia was in a terrible situation and needed to reconstruct itself, and so it needed a breathing space. So he came forward with this idea of peaceful coexistence, kind of a truce. They would declare a truce with the capitalist nations to give Russia a chance to recover itself. But at the same time, they were pursuing a revolutionary policy through the Communist International, where they were trying to build up communist parties in each country to pursue the class struggle and revolution in those countries. Now, when Stalin died, Khrushchev kind of reinterpreted this, and he basically declared that Russia would continue to argue for socialism, but it was hoping that the success of the Soviet Union would act as a model that would encourage other countries to follow that model, and that they wouldn't invade those countries, and they wouldn't try to foment revolution in them. And this was a kind of revisionist approach, which caused a lot of trouble between Stalin and Mao. And there's a whole story in and of itself. But China didn't actually. This debate didn't affect China much, because once China made the revolution in 1949, it faced a hostile capitalist world straight away. The capitalist nations America and Europe had been backing Chiang Kai-shek, and so when the communists came to power, they faced a complete embargo, and nobody recognized them. They all carried on recognizing the Chinese nationalists who had fled to Taiwan as the legitimate government of China. And so as a result, its international relations with the Western countries didn't exist. So China focused, which was a good thing actually for it, it focused on developing countries and its relationships with them. And in 1955, when the non-aligned movement began with this conference in Bandung in Indonesia, China had developed an intelligent strategy of what they called peaceful coexistence, which you talked about there, Khalid, about the principles of it, which were non-aggression and non-interference, and each country had to treat each other equally, and so on, which were the opposite of imperialism. So in that sense, they were good principles, and they went. Chu Enlai went to the conference in 1955 with these principles, and he was they proved to be very popular, and the non-aligned movement adopted those principles into the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence into their 10-point program. And China's been following this policy most of the time since then, and it has. I mean, actually, most people are not aware of the Charter of the United Nations. Has actually become a very radical document. It's very rarely referred to. It became a piece of paper, but because of the radicalization of the anti-colonial movement, and then various important conferences in the 70s, they were able, there was such a radical period that even the Western imperialist countries abstained on these things. So they actually went through. They didn't use their veto powers to stop them. So they became the policy of the United Nations. So peaceful coexistence policies and a new economic world order and all kind of other things became part of the Charter of the United Nations. But sadly, the non-aligned movement, again, the same problem that faced the Soviet Union, their economic weakness and their consequent military weakness meant that they couldn't implement any of these policies. But now we're now moving into a very different situation, where the BRICS could become an organization armed with this program for development, for peace and security, et cetera, that China's been coming up with. They have the potential to implement many of these things, which they were never able to do in the past. And so in that sense, the principles of peaceful coexistence have been encapsulated into these programs and initiatives that China's put forward for the United Nations and for the BRICS. So it does offer a lot of the one problem, and I see Yen is in our discussion here, which Yen has always made a very good point that the problems that China is facing in terms of its private sector is also being reflected internationally. And so you get these horrible Chinese fucking companies going abroad, private companies, and trying to do all sorts of exploitative policies in Africa and other countries, and abusing local people and so on. The state-owned companies are under much more better control. So when they go abroad, they focus on these infrastructure projects, and there's been, I think, there's been some improvements in that side of it. But the private companies are awful because they can be very capitalistic and brutal. And we deal with that in the paper, in the discussion paper. We come forward with ideas about that because it's something we can't ignore. You know, it's very important. Anyway, I think Mike, you wanted to come in, did you, Mike Rahman? I thought he did anyway. Yeah, oh Yen, you're having some problems with the network, are you? I think you said you're having some problems. If you wanted to come, any other comment you want to come in on this whole question of this movement, the BRICS movement, and all the challenge? I mean, do you think we're being we're putting too much emphasis on this question, or what do the comrades feel?
I feel the development of Kenya, I say Kenya, China is quite good. You know, we need a multipolar world that can give us a sign of relief instead of the unipolar world that America set for itself. But the other point to do, again, is for the progressive forces and for our countries also to note that when we enter into economic agreement with the Chinese companies, we should do that with our open eyes. The major problem in the third world, especially in Ghana today, is that Chinese, there are so many Chinese here, and a lot of them are into gold mining in particular. They are also into wholesale and retail that they are not supposed to be. Unfortunately, in the gold trade, they are brought in, they have the capital and they have the machines, and they are brought in by Ghanaians, and they are engaged in what is called galamsey. Galamsey is illegal mining. At present, there is a Chinese national woman going through trial on illegal mining. In the region that I am in the upper east region of Ghana, they have we have Sanjay that has been mining. It's a private Chinese company. The health and safety is almost zero, you know. And there is another one that is opening a company, but the Hong Kong company, they are Chinese, but Hong Kong is supposed to be independent, or yeah, it's part of China now. They are also there. The major thing about Sanjay.
Oh, we lost you there, Yen. As you said, you had some network problems.
Our elites are so corrupt, easily compromised, drive their way through. And then, but you can't blame the Chinese. If you are a state and then your people just collect bribes, you can't blame the Chinese state for that. You have to blame your own people. You have to blame the individual Chinese that are involved in this illegal mining. In one of their mining that we had in the past just 3 weeks ago, due to lack very unsound health principles, one fell down into their tutelage, their dump, and died. Somebody got his hand chopped off, somebody got his fingers chopped off. You know,
Right.
the Chinese, you know, I doubt whether they also have internal fight, and then they just come into plunder, to plunder. I mean, with the connivance of our middle classes, who take quite a little bit. But I think that if our middle classes were progressive, or the ruling classes were progressive, we could have a better deal. We could use the principle that China, because China wants some kind of, to be a superpower, you have to have friends. And we could use that as a leverage, and then have better trade deals with Chinese companies. But that is not happening now. Again, it's because of the corrupt officials. And like I say, we can't blame the Chinese state for that. But if we in the progressive movements will be advocating to have fair deals, you know, state to state, or if it is private to state, to have fair deals, not just give up our lands, give up our natural resources to be plundered by Chinese. There is some amount of anti-Chinese feeling. For example, this company that is called Sanjay, because of the anti-Chinese feeling, and because we in Ghana love being colonized by the British, you know, they changed their name from Sanjay to Air International. That sounds English, isn't it? You know, and friendly. Sandong, that bought the company, by the Australian company called Cardna company. This
Yeah, we're losing you a bit there, Yen.
in,
Yeah, the connection is not good.
in Cardna, you know, that also sound in, because Sandong is but I'm finished.
Yeah.
Hello,
Yen,
I'm finished.
yeah. Oh, thanks, man. Thanks very much. I mean, you know, Yen's raising very good points, and we actually have a section of the document about this, because I think that China has a responsibility. I mean, you're right that obviously the you know, when they go in with these projects into a country, then they can't, you know, there's corruption in those countries and things like that. But China has a lot of leverage, as you say. I mean, for one thing, they're providing the money to do these things, so they have a huge amount of leverage. And what we argue there is that up till now, often these deals are done by China deals state to state, right? And so they're dealing with bureaucrats, and there's always the danger of corruption, and even the question of what is the purpose of the project. And there's criticisms come later that this was not the right project. They're not doing the, let's say it was a railway line, that they're connecting the wrong places. It should be going here, whatever it might be. And that brings you into the question of that they could insist on involving the people who are going to be affected by these projects, and involving the population in the process of actually coming forward with these projects. So it's not just a few people at the top, or a few civil servants, or some corrupt individuals who think they get benefits out of it, but the actual population is involved. And that's important, because the Americans are organizing a massive propaganda campaign against the Belt and Road Initiative projects. They're bribing journalists all around the world to run hostile articles against them. They're trying to fund fake grassroots campaigns against them, and so on. So you need to have the people behind you in these projects. So you need to involve the people in the projects. So there's no reason why they can't have discussions in the country about what are the main things that need to be done in the country in terms of its infrastructure, maybe it's not a railway in such and such, maybe it's something else, and by involving the people, then they'll get support from the public, and that will help keep the project going and make it sure it's actually implemented, and it'll probably be a better project and more efficient. And then when they actually do the project, they need to involve all the people. So for example, the workforce need to have their unions involved, and if they haven't got unions, they should form unions to that effect. They need the farmers who are affected, they need to be involved in the project. They need to involve the consumers, whatever it might be. The relevant people who are affected by the project should be involved in how it's actually implemented. And then the end result of that will be you get a more popular process. You'll get a more efficient process and a less corrupt process if you do that. So and also the Chinese, they should have a code of conduct governing these Chinese private companies, and where local people are having problems with those local Chinese companies, they can then have a place they can go and complain about these things. So that and the Chinese government is coming up with all sorts of ideas in China about controlling private companies and their abuses, and they should do that the same, apply those things internationally. Now, of course, the problem that Yen talks about in terms of the gold mining, I mean, I have come across this problem in Turkey. Gold mining tends to be a quite dangerous process, where they use mercury to separate the gold from the rocks and so on, and that can cause very dangerous poisoning of the local landscape and the environment. And there's been lots of protests against gold mining because of that. And so, that's a particularly important area that needs to be governed by code of conduct and procedures. So, I think that what Yen was raising there is obviously a major problem. And I think he's right where the local society where they're doing these projects needs to be. We need to have class struggle going on there to ensure that interests of working people are represented. But we also should be putting pressure on the Chinese to not just allow their companies to go and do what the hell they like abroad and damage the interests. Because what will be the end result of that is that will damage the image of China and its projects and of the whole Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS, and that isn't good for us, So we've got to bring these things under control and make sure they work for the benefit of working people. Otherwise, what's the point of it, So I think what Yen is raising there is a very important issue and very good, Other comrades, Mike, did you want to say something?
Yep.
Yeah, you need. Yeah, there you go. That's it. You need to unmute.
You hear me now?
Yeah, hearing you now, loud and clear.
Okay, I just came back from the United States. I'm in London now, just a couple hours ago. Yes, you're still
Okay.
hearing me?
Yeah, we're hearing you great. No problem. Go ahead.
And we just about 10 minutes ago put on the internet because it wasn't on.
Ah, okay. So you missed the introduction and
Yeah, BT just
okay.
came and installed it. But an hour ago, we just
Okay.
got the password and so
have you had any chance to look through the document at all, or?
No, I haven't. I've been traveling, you see.
Okay. Do you have some general points you wanted to make about the geopolitics
Yes.
going on now and the BRICS and
Yes,
things
sir.
like that?
Yes. Continuing from what Yen was saying, it seems to be a general policy which we touched upon about the Chinese government controlling these private companies. The last point you made is very crucial, and that I don't know how we could see, Chinese can do a lot of things to help ordinary people. You can't spread socialism if you don't engage with the progressive forces in the country on the ground. The Chinese state tend to have place too much emphasis on the state. the different governments and the officials, and that's where the corruption takes place, and the ordinary people don't benefit from the policies and programs of China. So situation is very confusing, again explained in great detail. The same thing happened in Guyana. I suppose it's happening in other parts of the world, on the developed world. So they need to get back to this non-aligned movement that they began, and they need to have a conscious effort about how they can use their power to influence the economic development in each of these countries that are very rich in resources. I mean, there's a lot of this. I think we need to continue to have a lot of discussions on what's going on right now in Africa, and the influence just having in right now as we speak in Nigeria and all these other countries that have really come out and made it absolutely clear that they're not going to tolerate any more of uh, European intervention in their countries. That has gone down very well among the local population in other countries too, not only in their countries, but in other countries, people are very excited with the fact that the role Russia and China is playing in standing to defend these countries that have come out against French imperialism, US imperialism. But I want to talk more, just to link what Yen said, and maybe you can give some more explanation on why this phenomena that is developing in Guyana, where in the past 20, 30 years, entrepreneurs used to go and they bring a lot of stuff from China in large quantities and sell it in their shops and so on. What's happened in the last 10 years, that there's a large number of Chinese, I don't know whether they are individuals or they're linked to the state, but you have a huge amount of Chinese supermarkets, hardware and grocery and all kinds of things that you can find. And they are putting the local entrepreneurs out of business. And it's a good thing in the sense that um, we don't have that influx of manufactured goods coming from the Western world anymore. The Chinese have actually flooded the market, selling whatever they're producing, their hardware, all kinds of equipment that ordinary people would ever dream of having, and now able to have access to it, like reading machines. I mean, all kinds of equipment, all kinds of electrical equipment, and so on. And they sell them at quite reasonable price, and it's actually in relatively in very close approximation where people live. So the people don't have to go to the cities as they used to buy any of these things. They just walk across the road. And this happened throughout Guyana. I don't know if it's happening in Ghana too, or in Pakistan, or all the other countries. But this is what is happening. And they're able to do that. And I think it's a good thing, because they they bring it in large bulk, ship the containers, and then they distribute it. So they have a conscious distribution operation that they supply all the supermarkets and their stores and so on. So they're able to sell their stuff at a cheaper rate. I think from a marketing uh, uh, um, concept that the Chinese, I think, I don't know, I'm just surmising that the Chinese state is probably actually doing this, getting their goods out directly into these countries and creating massive competition against the Western manufacturers and so on. So that's a positive thing. The negative effect is that destroying the local entrepreneurs, which is perhaps a good thing because these guys have been exploiting the consumers in Guyana for a very, very long time by bringing these things, buying it cheap, bringing it there, and then making a lot of money out of it. But I take the point, and I don't know what we can do to actually get the Chinese state to actually clamp down more openly, because as you quite rightly said, the Chinese government is having a bad image because people say these things, everything that these private Chinese do, they say, look, the Chinese are doing this and the Chinese are doing that. And Yan has explained that it's not the Chinese state, but they need to make it absolutely clear, and they need to deal with their nationals. Um, I don't know how they can do that because the individual capitals, roaming around the world, I don't know if they can have any control. How much control can you have when they're floating about in the Western world or out of China? But something needs to be done. And I think one of the things you suggested, they should have a international code of practice, respect for the indigenous countries that they're in, respect the laws and ensure that they ensure that these things are done. But there are lots of the state is intervening in. They are in Guyana. They're building the bridge, a major crossing in Guyana. The Chinese a bid. This Chinese state company has bid for that bridge, and they are now building the bridge. And they're also bidding for other things. So the state companies are actually replacing the private Chinese companies that did terrible things as Yen explained. So I think gradually, if I may say so, gradually the Chinese state companies are actually engaging with the respective countries, the government to government, which is the way to go. Because if they can join with them in partnership, that the indigenous countries, their respective countries have 51% of the whatever project that they are doing, it shows that they have respect for the respective countries and that they can work with them in partnership to develop their country using all the socialist principles of development. I think that's a good thing. But we need to have a conscious um, engagement with the Chinese to let them know. I don't know how we can do that. I suppose we need to have a coordinated approach. How do we deal with these things? Maybe can we do it through the embassies as a socialist organization in our respective countries? I don't know. Just as a discussion we need to have, because we can have this discussion and debate and we just left like that. I think we have to intervene, and how to intervene is something that we need to discuss. Over to you, Pat.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Mike. Yeah. Yeah, I think Mike is. I mean that. Yeah, we're not having these discussions for just the sake of it. We want to intervene with these programs and these policies, these attitudes, and so on. And I think we will. And I think it's so. For example, a classic example was the local, the content of employment in these projects, these infrastructure projects. So there is a natural instinct for the Chinese companies to bring their workers with them because the Chinese companies, without doubt, have become the leading infrastructure developers in the world, and they leave everybody else for dust. And so in the process of that, they have developed a whole set of powerful equipment, which is the fastest tunnel diggers and bridge layers and track layers and whatever. And on top of that, their workforce have become incredibly skilled And this is skills that are not easily gained, in doing these things on time or even ahead of schedule at a very good price and so on. And so, of course, there's a natural instinct to want to make sure that when you agree to do an infrastructure project in a country, that it's done well, and that it's done on time and the budget and all these things. But on the other hand, there's a need to transfer technology, to transfer skills, and so there's an awareness of this. And so now I think there's a general 20%, 80% proportion where they're trying to make sure that 80% of the workforce employed on these projects are local people from that country, and that the Chinese may bring in specialists, but with the idea that they're going to that they will have training programs so that they will upskill those workers locally, and those workers will it'll become a career. So they will go from working on building a highway to building another bridge, and they will go. So they will build up skills. So my family's all from Ireland, and so Irish people develop fantastic construction skills, and so you now have Irish guys who go around the world on big infrastructure projects, and they bring with them all the skills and knowledge that they've gained, and that can be done in every area where these infrastructure projects develop, because they're not just one-off. There's more and more of them that need to be done in that particular country or in that region, group of countries. And so that's a very important factor and role that China should be consciously playing, and which I think they are doing. In the early days, they wasn't so good, but I think there's a consciousness now of the need to employ local labor and train them up and make them. And for those workers, it's very important because they get a skill, they get a career, so that they don't just do that one-off project. They go on to other projects in their country or in their region, and that's an important social role that the whole Belt and Road Initiative and so on needs to play. And the other thing that what Mike's talking about there is that I think that where problems are arising with the Chinese community in a particular country, that the left should be, and the labor movement should be, taking those things on board and challenging China to come forward with solutions to that. So, for example, there's no reason why the retail trade and the wholesale trade can't be localized. It doesn't have to be Chinese. I don't mean don't mean we need to be anti-Chinese, but that the efficiencies of the Chinese wholesale and retail business can be transferred to the local people, as well. And where if there's areas of discontent with how they're operating, they can be overcome consciously, but it's got to be done. It's got to be done in an open and transparent way, and the Chinese are open to have. I mean, one of the interesting things I remember, Varoufakis. You remember the left finance minister in the Greek government, the Tsipras led government a few years ago. He made the point that in his experience of working with the Chinese, that he was quite surprised that, so for example, the Chinese bought the port of Piraeus, which is the leading port in Greece. And the workers were complaining and so on. So he went with the workers, he went to the Chinese authorities and said, look, the workers are complaining about the conditions and various other conditions and various other aspects of what your modernization of the port is doing. And the Chinese said, yeah, we're happy to, we approve of trade unions. These are the Chinese owners said, we approve of trade unions and we're willing to negotiate about the working hours and conditions. And we don't want to make our modernization of the port at the expense of the workers. And he found that actually the Chinese, if you took the problem to them, they were very open to having them dealt with. And of course, then you've got the whole question of the Chinese government. You can put them under pressure, but Yen makes the point. It's the class struggle has to continue and intensify, in fact, if we're going to be able to make the best of these developments. It's not a question of having, being passively thinking the Chinese are going to do everything for you. It's not going to happen like that, Okay, I think Sajjad, did you want to say something? I think you were giving some indication. Did you want to come in?
No comment, but I'm waiting for publishing it.
Okay, yeah, well, I mean, Pakistan is a classic example of the Chinese CPEC program, isn't it? Do you want to say, Sajjad, do you want to say anything about that? What the program is and what problems it has, and so on.
CPEC was a great initiative led by the PP government, and it's implemented. It's executed during Nawaz Sharif time. Unfortunately, when Imran Khan came in government, he suspended it. And due to that, the progress of the projects were late and delays. But Chinese are still continue some things. They are working on some dams. But I think the Nawaz Sharif government was not in creative minded. They did some good projects which Chinese need and or which Pakistan is needing. But some projects they did very bad. Not inclusive, all good. But during that period, the economies was flourishing. The job issue was solved, and industrial growth becomes much more, and it impacts good on the economy. But after that, we became in chaos, and now the government is going, and they are. It's a hodgepodge government, but still, Chinese are in, and they are trying to make their participation to get much program, because for Gwadar port there is too much things we need to run the project. The main problem is we have to provide it energy or like each and everything. With the collaboration of Iran, we can do each and everything, because we made some contact during last PP government with Iran, gas pipeline projects and other projects, which is still not executed or not taken by government due to Saudi or American influence. But now, just a few minutes earlier, the Bilawal statement about these pipeline projects. If we get energy resources from Iran, it will be more cheaper to us, because no transportation will involve. Only with the help of pipeline we can get gas and petroleum products through pipelines, and it is very easy, because the Chinese have already completed the roadwork projects all around this, and only if they got the energy, the Gwadar port power may start. So I think we got a good impact by Chinese. They did a great job in Tharkol power project, and they are too much in there also. It's good, but we have to highlight it how or in which way we made contacts with Chinese, because if government of Pakistan or our establishment is very corrupt, because if they lose the lacunas, the contract, then some case of corruptions may arise, or like some bad projects maybe come in pipeline. The actual needed projects, Chinese like to do the good projects, but the establishments have their own willnesses about the execution. They are not, our establishment is not good. It is not pro public. This is the biggest problem. So these are the some, but CPEC is good because our youth was getting job and industry was running because they are using mostly the local material. Due to that, industry flourish. If the again CPEC is come full in full swing running, then the some problems of Pakistan may be solved. Only this I can.
Thanks, Sajjad. Did you say that just within the last few minutes they've made some announcement? Yeah, this whole geopolitical thing that's developing is very fast, isn't it? It's happening all the time. One of the points that the traditional or the Trotskyist movement often makes the point where they counterpose these geopolitical developments to the need for independent class struggle in each country. And I think that there's no need for us to counterpose these two questions. I mean, after all, we fight for independent class struggle in our countries, and we also demand things that the government should do certain things, don't we? So I don't think we need to counterpose these two things. We go into this question in our paper a bit, and so you know the fact that we're fighting for geopolitical changes doesn't, you know, it goes hand in hand with the fight for independent class struggle in our own countries, doesn't it? You know, and we've always got to keep that in mind so that we're not caught up with just talking about geopolitics. We're also talking about our own. You know, that's the broader context, but within that, we fight for the class struggle in our own countries, don't we? So the thing, you know, the two things go hand in hand. I think that's how I see it.
There is some very big problem in geopolitical sense, because Pakistan exports is normally towards Middle East and towards Europe or USA. Our mostly exports are depending on that, and imports are also depend on Middle East and Europe in source of machinery, or some things we are importing from China also, especially in industrial sector. And over the main the over labor force is mostly working in Middle East and Europe and America. By this, we are talking about 25 to 30 billion dollars earning by that, and it also depend on Middle East and Europe and America also. So, the geopolitical situation is insisting on Pakistani establishment. They have to go with Chinese, but they are here the elites have their own interest in Middle East and with West. This is the biggest problem. And this contradiction is not solved by our political elite. This is a question mark, and this needs a solution. And we like Matlab last time I talked with Khalid, and last meeting Manzoor raised the question how we center point Chinese development as a role model in our political thinking, how we can put up these things. I am waiting about that. I was telling them because you and Khalid are going to finalize the Chinese book. When we will publish the book in Urdu here, we will got, I think, a good thought about that, and we can put something as a suggestive for PPP work, how this model can be executed in our political demands and how it can be implemented. So we can, with class questions, with our non-going schools, children, with unemployment and with major issues, we can contact with this. Because
Yeah.
it is an important question.
Yeah, exactly. How within the general context of that geopolitics, how you then apply it within a particular country. You know, I mean, there is the potential to use these questions to then make big demands in your country.
Yeah.
You know what I mean, and offer a way forward for development. I mean, one of the things we deal with in, and by the way, Sajjad raises a very important question of the, you know, because I used to go to the Middle East a lot, and such a large proportion of the workforce in the Middle East are from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from Sri Lanka, etc. You know, from India, from that region, and you know that actually brings to life, doesn't it, these questions? The other thing that we raise in the paper, which is about, which is a very understandable question, which is why was it that the countries that got the first mover advantage and developed in the 19th century and even earlier, who became the, you know, the dominant countries, you know, of Europe and the richer countries of America and Japan. When you look at the world, there were other countries in the world which were larger geographically, had more natural resources, and actually had bigger populations, but those countries have remained poor. And so the interesting thing is that the countries that emerged first and got that advantage, they stayed on top in the world. You know, and the poorer countries, even when they had actually more potential natural resources and larger populations, stayed down below, kept down. And I think we point out that this was not an accident. So that the development of the countries of the world in terms of wealth and so on did not happen in a natural way, but that the countries who happened by chance to be the first countries to get ahead, they used their wealth and power to keep the other countries, even if those countries had more natural resources and bigger populations and were bigger countries, they kept them down and kept them poor. And thus we stayed locked into this power system for hundreds of years. And with the ones who gained advantage first being on top. But now we have a situation where the BRICS offers the potential to bring this kind of world order to an end, and for countries to be able to take full advantage of their natural advantages, you know, in terms of population size, resources, country, location, geographic location, so on. And this could change the whole balance of power in the world dramatically. And particularly if they do it on a basis of not trying to build a world order based around power and exploitation, but around cooperation. where, you know, it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. We can all develop economically together and rise together and overcome the poverty and disease and other problems of the past. So I think that all these questions are posed in this development, and it's going to be very, you know, it's going to be very interesting to see how this all pans out, you know. But certainly, I think, I don't know if the other comrades agree with me, but I think we're living in a fascinating, unprecedented period where all sorts of possibilities are there, and then and what we should be plugged into that and influencing these developments as a network as much as possible, you know. Any other comrade who would like to contribute? Roy, I think you did try to come back in at some point. Are you still there? Roy, you were trying to say something.
Yeah, I think it's when you made a question about about BRICS, and when you comment on it, it made me think that it's a sort of wait and see what happens in a way. I think the you know, certainly they're not all socialist countries within BRICS, and that there was I think India was just recently, it was reported that they were saying it's going too fast, you know, we shouldn't be inviting all these new countries in to join, and you know, they are, it could potentially is just an anti-West group rather than a pro-socialist group, if you like. I know, notwithstanding what you said earlier on about, you know, the power of China, and it's showing by example that's how you can develop. But there's a bit of a worry about what the intentions of people are who want to be in BRICS, and the ones who are already in it who might be wanting to fashion it in a different way. I don't know. I don't know if you've got a view on that, Pat, at all, really.
Well, I think India is obviously India is approaching these. We're in a rather strange situation because I was saying this to Khalid. We were talking about this the other day, and I was saying it reminds me. Do you remember that movie with Charlton Heston, Ben-Hur? You know, when that classic Roman movie, ancient Roman movie, where you've got the chariot race, right? And the most dangerous point of the chariot race is when the two chariots pull up alongside each other, and then what happens is the hold on just a second, the chariots pull up alongside each other, and the bad guy usually reveals some nefarious weapon he's got on the wheel, and he tries to use that to get close to the other one so he can destroy their wheels or push him off the course and kill him or whatever, or make him lose the race. And we're a bit like that now in terms of this, that the China and the alliance of countries that it's built around it and its strategy has kind of caught up with the West and is side by side with it. And if it keeps going, then China will overtake the West. But they're in that dangerous point where they're side by side, where the maximum friction can happen. And in that situation, what's happening is you get these countries like India, Turkey, etc., who take a transactional attitude towards this situation, and they think, well, these two forces are neck and neck, and we can play them off against each other and get benefits for our country from it. It's a very short-sighted attitude, but it's an inevitable part of the problem, isn't it? And so India is one of those where they, for short-sightedly, are looking at how they can benefit. They can get benefits out of this from the Western side, maybe from the Chinese side, whatever. On top of that, India feels very threatened by China, and it doesn't take the attitude of working with China. It sees it wants to be a superpower, India, and it sees China as far more superior in that respect, and they see their kind of their main problem is try and be part of this Western alliance against China. And so but on the other hand, it's a complicated situation because India has got its own geopolitical things, which it's trying to do with the Middle East and elsewhere. And so it can't appear to be trying to hold back the BRICS. So it does look like India. So for example, there was a lot of speculation that India will, that Modi wouldn't go to the summit because he doesn't want to meet with Xi from China. But he's come out and said, no, that's not the situation. And we're not going to stop the BRICS becoming bigger. What we want to do is we want to insist on there being a set of criteria and a process in which BRICS members are considered and joined and so on, which is okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that if it takes, and the Chinese are patient. So if it takes time for the BRICS to develop, there's nothing wrong. It could be a mistake that if it becomes very easy to join the BRICS and lots of people join, they can just as easily leave. So maybe, that it's a good process that they take a bit of time to consider the implications, and it takes, if it takes a couple of years for the BRICS to grow, that's not a problem, So I think that the Indians do look like they're trying to work with the Americans against the Chinese, but they're also having to balance other things. And so I suspect that what will happen is that the BRICS will grow, get stronger, and if China's economic strategy works, there will come a point where it will develop its own momentum, and nobody will be able to stop this process, and it will develop an alternative currency to the dollar. And so the West will no longer be able to dominate the world as they have done using imperialistic methods. And therefore that will be a very progressive development for it offers the chance for, if we get out of this geopolitical competition and rivalry and get back to what it should be all about, is how do we lift the poor people out of their poverty? How do we get development in these countries? How do we end these conflicts, these military conflicts, and bring peace to these regions? And if the BRICS development and the strategy that China is pushing behind it works, then it will raise living standards and reduce the conflicts, and that will be a very good thing for the future of the world and working people. Something that we should welcome, and I think it will be good for it will be good for us as a socialist movement, because it's actually giving credibility to cooperative development as opposed to domination and interference and war and all the things that come with capitalism, isn't it? Imperialism. So I think that it makes, and in each country, it makes it easier to argue for socialist ideas. If these are becoming the dominant, principles in the world, that China's pushing that we've got to have a world based on cooperation rather than conflict, of common prosperity rather than exploitation. And these are the buzzwords that China's pushing, the principles they're pushing. That's got to be good for us in our campaign within each country for socialist ideas. That's how I see it anyway. We should take advantage of this, I don't know how other comrades see it, whether they think that. I mean, there is a section on the left are very cynical about all this, but I don't see why we need to be. I think it's a positive development for us. I don't know what other comrades feel. Any other comrades want to say anything about this? Wally, did you want to say anything? Did you want to comment about any of this, you feel? Or Halid, did you want to come back on any of this?
Not really. I think it's good discussion. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we've probably the meetings have gone on for a good time now, isn't it? And this is this is obviously a very deep question with huge number of consequences for the world. And it's an ongoing moving feast, isn't it? We don't know how it's going to turn out. I don't know about you, but I was, as a boy, I was growing up when I was coming into politics, we were living under the shadow of American imperialism. So, for example, when I was in the UK and we were developing a socialist movement in the militant and everything, and one of the major questions that was always coming up, people were saying, well, this is all very well, but won't the Americans invade Britain if this, if the socialist Britain becomes a possibility? And that was the kind of, the balance of power in the world that we were dealing with. But things, these countries, I mean, if you look at the G20, for example, a lot of the G20 countries are in the developing world, and they're becoming powerful economies. Malaysia and Indonesia and Brazil and South Africa and Nigeria and I mean, and who would have thought that Saudi Arabia, which has played such a reactionary role in all my lifetime, would start to be turning its back on the US, and it's incredible, and be turning itself towards this development. It's a very different world we're going into, and with all sorts of possibilities there from a progressive point of view. And I think that we need to keep our eye on this development, follow it closely, and through that be able to maybe intervene in some ways and influence it. And I think the fact that we've got a positive but critical attitude towards China, unlike a lot of the left has got this. They're either most of the left seems to be dismissive of China and saying it's capitalist and imperialist and so on, which I don't think explains anything about all these geopolitical developments. Doesn't make any sense what China's doing. I mean, why would China, if it was so capitalist and imperialist, be doing all these things? That doesn't make any sense. Why would they be making all these anti-imperialist arguments and building up all this movement against imperialism if they were just trying to create another imperialism? Doesn't make any sense, never happened before. So one section of the left dismisses these developments in a cynical way, a lot of the socialist left and the Trotskyist left and so on. And then you've got another section of the left which is emerging, which is just uncritical, giving, saying, oh, we support China and everything China's doing, and they're kind of even doing that with Russia, aren't they? And they're doing it with some of these other countries. But I think the fact that we approach this in a positive spirit, but critical, and trying to put forward ways to overcome the problems that are obviously there in China or in other countries, I think is a very healthy approach, and I think fits in with what the attitude of most working people have in the world towards these developments. They welcome some aspects of them, they're doubtful about some of them. Quite understandable. I mean, given all the history of empires rising and falling, and you know what I mean, you can understand that cynicism and that questioning. But I think we need to go beyond that. And Mike, did you want to come in? You got your hand
Yes,
up.
but
Go for it, man.
I'm a bit enthusiastic like you, probably over enthusiastic,
It's possible, yeah.
because we have never seen in human history this level of understanding and cooperation beyond what has happened after the 1917 revolution that virtually changed the world and established two different systems. But what China is doing is actually putting people on the spot and actually creating this level of inspiration that never exists across the world following the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think we have a very important role to play because we have been talking among ourselves a very long time, but our ideas are not really got to the a larger section of people or a larger section of activists. And I will suggest two things that we should do. I know you've been trying to work with to set up the YouTube channel. I don't know how far you've gone with that. And the other thing is that if you were to be able to do that, that's one thing to think that we can speak to the masses of people. But then we should begin as an international organization with some credibility to be able to establish a formal structure where people, comrades in the different countries, respective countries, could at least we can have a broader discussion on some of these things that we're talking about, and maybe set a date every month for a start that we have on Zoom. We let at least 5 people from the different countries. The comrades can choose who they want to actually participate in a broader discussion and allow them the opportunity to ask questions. So we need to build a sort of a cadreship as an international. And then we produce a lot of information, we can release those information to them. But we're not making full use of the possibilities that exist for us using social media. I think if we're not putting too much pressure on you, we need to broaden the scope of our organization by giving more responsibility to individual comrades who are perhaps skilled in particular area, like Yen, for instance, is very skilled in computer and new technology and so on. And the other comrades who I don't know very well. So we need to identify their different skills and bring that to use for the benefit of this international. So I don't know what you think about that.
I think, yeah, I agree with that. In fact, we've been on a long journey. I think we're coming to the end. We're coming to the fruition of that journey. That one of the big problems with our network was that we knew what we were against in terms of the lack of democracy in the IMT and the CWI and so on, and we knew there were things that we didn't agree with. But we hadn't got a clear idea of what we were for and what it was that what kind of program we were fighting for, how to go about it and so on. I think we're beginning, it's been a long journey, but I think we're getting to that point. So for example, we're gonna put out shortly pull together this documentation we've done on China and have a simple introduction, 2-page introduction, so that because there are people who don't have the time to read these longer documents, but they'll get an idea, it'll summarize what's in the document, and then they'll be able to read into it if they want to. We're also planning to produce to launch this Understanding China YouTube channel in October, and around the same time we've got all the material together for a book. And so we can use, the purpose of the book is really for promoting these ideas and finding ways to get people to come to meetings, to this, book launch meetings to discuss the whole thing on China and the geopolitics of it, and our unique approach to it. And I think you're right, Mike, that now is the time that we're going to have to start to, we've got the chart, we've got all the material, we can reach out to people, and we've got to find ways to involve them. And you might be right, that might be a good way to do it, that we could invite people, contacts of ours or intellectuals we think are good to be involved in this discussion. You know, we've done I think we've reached a point now internally where we've worked out a pretty good approach to China, to geopolitics, to how we approach it. Even on the question of social, you know, we've had lots of discussion about how we would develop socialism in a different way, learning the lessons of the Soviet Union, the lessons of the mistakes made in the past in social democracy. I think we've done all that, and we now can pull all that together, and actually we can start to really develop our network in a much more effective way with all these things. And that's probably what we need. That's probably what we need to focus on in the next period. So maybe what we could do the next month, we could have a discussion of pulling all these threads together, and what we could do practically to, you know, to take advantage of this work we've been doing over a long time. I mean, the problem we had was that because we didn't have an alternative, we knew what we were against, but we didn't have an alternative. It was very difficult for us to then start to build the network. But I think we've moved beyond that point now. I think we've got a general consensus among the comrades about how we're approaching this stuff, and we're now in a position to pull the material together, to reach out to people, and I think our position will be very popular. I think it matches organically, links in with what most people on the left actually think, and a lot of working people think. You know, they see these developments taking place geopolitically. They like a lot of aspects of it. It's giving them hope, but they want to know a way forward to how China can solve its problems, how we can solve our problems internally. Often these things are connected, aren't they? You know, a new model for the public sector, all these things we've been talking about. I think we need to pull all this stuff together now. So maybe what we could do is we can have a meeting next month to start to do that. It could be an open discussion. What do the comrades think? Do they think it's a good idea? How, you know, what are the conclusions we draw from all of this? And how do we then start to practically move forward? What do the comrades think? Do you think it's good? Yeah, generally?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, well, you know, it's been a long journey. And me and Hal have been working hard on this for the last couple of years. But we feel we've got somewhere, you know. And the events,
maybe
and events are moving. Funnily enough, the actual events are moving in our direction, which is good. Sorry, Roy, go ahead.
just saying, you know, from when you say we've got, you know, we have come to an important point in the development of the network that maybe, you know, we should think about changing the name. We can say we've got more of an identity now. If the polishers are coming together, and we can say what we stand for, if you like, rather than having been a long network journey moving forward. I'm not saying we form a party or anything like that, but we have some sort of identity, which when people know who we are. We talked last time, didn't we, about perhaps having some badges and things like that, you know, which t-shirts or whatever. Perhaps it's something to think about at all.
Yeah, well, why not? Yeah, I mean, all these things flow, don't they? You know you know, we've got a generic name at the moment, Socialist Network. If comrades can come up with better ideas that express what we're trying to achieve, right? Then yeah, good, you know, great. So I think I think you're right, Roy, that the and Mike, you know, that we can do these things. So let's have a meeting next month, maybe an open discussion about where do we go from having done all this work, theoretical work, and come to what I think is a good way forward, and actually a positive perspective. We can then discuss how we then put that into practice, both in terms of propaganda, organization, campaigning. Yeah.
Yes, I think we should do that. Time is flying, as you said, but things are moving all the time. Every
Right.
day, new things are coming in the fore, and there are lots of other networks that we can have dialogue with, who have a similar approach to us, like Professor Wolf. I've listened to him very well. He has a similar approach to us.
Sure. Yeah.
We don't necessarily agree with everything, but he has a pro-China critical approach, which is similar to us.
Right.
So maybe you can stretch out a hand to him and have a dialogue with him and invite him on one of our forums, where you and him or one of us can have a panel discussion with the other people, like what I'm suggesting, and we broaden, because they have an audience too. They have a network, so their people get to know that we exist. If we don't sell ourselves,
Right.
the ideas will remain in us.
So Mike, save these suggestions for next month, yeah.
Okay.
And we'll go into them in some detail, yeah.
Right,
I mean,
right.
there is, for example, there's a group that's been formed, that's emerged over the last year, called Friends of Socialist China, and they're very active online in YouTube.
Okay, well, we can invite them to talk. Have a talk.
Yeah, you know, I mean, you know, Corbyn, funny, do you remember Corbyn intervened in one of our discussions? You remember that? Jeremy Corbyn came on board in one of our discussions. Do you remember briefly?
Yes, I introduced
yeah,
him.
you introduced him, didn't you? Yeah. You know, I mean, even people like him, I think that if we approach this, if we express this in the right way, they will be very sympathetic to the idea of a positive but critical support for China and these geopolitical developments, rather than a kind of Stalinistic, slavish, we support everything the Chinese regime does, or we support everything Putin. You know, this kind of mentality of the old days. I think people have moved past that, and they're not really into that anymore. They understand that that didn't work. In fact, it actually encouraged the fall of the Soviet Union. You know. All right, comrades. Thank you very much. And we've recorded the meeting, by the way, so we'll put it up on our forum. So any comrades who haven't been here, like Themos and Wasif and so on, they can listen to it afterwards. All right.
I didn't hear your presentation. I will listen to it.
All right, then. Okay.
Thank you very much.